By 146 BCE, Rome stood without a peer in the Mediterranean world. In a single year, its armies had destroyed Carthage in North Africa and Corinth in Greece, eliminating the last major rivals to Roman authority. These victories marked the end of centuries of interstate competition and the beginning of an unprecedented imperial condition. Rome now controlled territories stretching from Hispania to Asia Minor, ruling populations that far exceeded the citizen body of the Republic. Yet the political institutions governing this empire remained those of a city-state, designed for the management of Italy rather than the administration of a transcontinental dominion. The immediate consequences of conquest were material and visible. Vast quantities of war booty flowed into Rome, documented in triumphal records and literary accounts such as those of Polybius. Enslaved populations were transported in large numbers to Italy, particularly from Greece, Asia Minor, and North Africa. Archaeological evidence from rural Italy indicates a sharp increase in slave-based agricultural production during the mid-2nd century BCE. Large estates, or latifundia, expanded across formerly smallholder land, producing grain, wine, and olive oil for export rather than subsistence. These estates were typically controlled by members of the senatorial and equestrian elites, who possessed the capital to invest in land acquisition and enslaved labor. At the same time, Italy's traditional citizen farmer class entered a period of sustained decline. Archaeological surveys in regions such as Etruria and Campania show the abandonment of small farms beginning in the mid-2nd century BCE. Literary sources, including later accounts by Appian, describe how prolonged military service kept citizen soldiers away from their land for years at a time. Upon return, many found their farms ruined or absorbed by neighboring estates. Unable to compete economically with slave-run operations, displaced citizens migrated toward Rome itself, contributing to urban population growth and increased dependence on public distributions. This demographic shift altered the social balance of the Republic. Rome's urban population expanded rapidly, but employment opportunities failed to keep pace. While public building programs absorbed some labor, many citizens became politically active without possessing stable economic foundations. The Roman political system, which relied on assemblies weighted by property class, now faced a growing population of citizens whose voting power was limited but whose presence intensified competition for patronage. Records of grain shortages and emergency distributions suggest increasing strain on urban infrastructure during this period. Despite these transformations, Rome's governing structures remained largely unchanged. The Senate continued to dominate foreign policy, finance, and administration, but it lacked a professional bureaucratic apparatus capable of managing provincial territories systematically. Provincial governors were appointed annually, often prioritizing personal enrichment over long-term stability. Inscriptions from provinces such as Sicily and Asia record disputes over taxation and judicial abuse, indicating inconsistent administration. These practices generated resentment among subject populations while reinforcing elite competition at Rome, where successful provincial commands translated directly into wealth and political influence. The expansion of empire also intensified inequality within the ruling class itself. Senators with access to lucrative provinces or war commands accumulated disproportionate resources, while others struggled to maintain status. Competition for magistracies became increasingly aggressive, as electoral success now promised access to military command and economic opportunity beyond Italy. The Republic's political culture, traditionally grounded in shared norms and gradual advancement, began to reward exceptional success rather than collective stability. Geography further magnified these pressures. Rome's dominance of the Mediterranean sea lanes facilitated long-distance trade and grain imports, particularly from Sicily, Sardinia, and later North Africa. While this ensured food supply for the city, it reduced reliance on Italian agriculture, accelerating the decline of domestic smallholders. Coin hoards and trade amphorae recovered from Italian ports reflect the growing integration of Rome into an imperial economic system that privileged scale over sustainability. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome had achieved unmatched external security but internal imbalance. Military expansion had enriched the state while destabilizing its social foundation. Political authority remained concentrated in institutions incapable of mediating the new realities of empire. Economic transformation altered patterns of land ownership, labor, and citizenship without corresponding reforms in governance. These developments did not immediately produce civil war, but they eroded the consensus that had sustained republican stability for centuries. As wealth concentrated, population patterns shifted, and competition intensified, reform became both unavoidable and contested. Efforts to address land distribution and citizenship would soon emerge, challenging entrenched interests and exposing the limits of republican adaptation. As economic inequality widened across Italy, political reform moved from theoretical debate into open confrontation, setting the stage for the first internal ruptures of the Roman state. Before we continue our journey through Rome's transformation, hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to receive the daily Nightfall history video, and leave a comment telling us your favorite part of this segment. In 133 BCE, Roman politics crossed a line it would never retreat from. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs, initiated a series of agrarian reforms aimed at restoring land to the small citizen farmers who had been displaced by the expansion of latifundia. These reforms were grounded in legislation dating back to the Lex Licinia Sextia of the early 4th century BCE, but Gracchus sought enforcement mechanisms that the Senate had long ignored. He proposed the creation of a commission to redistribute public land, known as ager publicus, capping individual holdings and granting plots to dispossessed citizens. Literary sources, including Plutarch and Appian, record that these reforms directly challenged entrenched senatorial interests, who had acquired extensive estates in violation of earlier limits. Epigraphic records confirm that large tracts in Campania and Etruria were subject to redistribution under his measures, although implementation was contested. The Senate's opposition to Tiberius' reforms escalated rapidly. Traditional procedural mechanisms, such as senatorial debate and tribunician veto, proved insufficient to block legislation that had the popular assembly's support. In response, Gracchus bypassed the Senate, bringing proposals directly to the concilium plebis. This move broke with republican precedent, undermining the customary balance between magistrates and assemblies. Contemporary accounts describe senators attempting to obstruct proceedings physically, resulting in confrontations in the forum. When political negotiation failed, violence became a tool of enforcement. Tiberius was murdered during a riot in 133 BCE, an event formally noted by Roman annalists as the first instance of lethal political reprisal within the city itself. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus sought to continue his brother's reforms, taking office as tribune in 123 BCE. His program expanded land distribution and extended citizen rights to the Italian allies, integrating reforms into judicial and financial administration. Gaius also introduced measures to regulate grain supply, known as the Lex Fermentaria, and proposed colonies for settlement, which required significant legislative coordination. The Senate, again resistant, mobilized urban and elite networks to oppose his policies. In 121 BCE, Gaius and many of his supporters were killed during an armed confrontation sanctioned under the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree granting magistrates extraordinary authority to protect the state. Literary accounts, including Appian, record that several hundred citizens died in the purge, signaling the formal normalization of political bloodshed as a method of resolving disputes. These events demonstrated that republican institutions were increasingly inadequate to manage the pressures of social and economic transformation. Land redistribution, citizen enfranchisement, and urban migration had intensified competition for resources and influence, yet the Senate retained its conservative stance, relying on procedural authority rather than negotiation. The repeated breakdown of constitutional processes set precedents for the use of force in politics, which would later be mirrored in military interventions and the rise of personal armies. Archaeological surveys in Campania reveal continued tension between private estates and redistributed plots, illustrating the enduring material dimension of these reforms. The Gracchus episodes also highlighted the fragility of political consensus within the ruling elite. While the reforms themselves were designed to address structural inequalities, the response of the Senate revealed an elite unwilling to compromise. Electoral manipulation, violent suppression, and the deployment of extraordinary magistracies destabilized the norms that had governed Roman governance for centuries. The result was a systemic rupture. The Republic's mechanisms for mediation no longer guaranteed order. Citizen assemblies gained legal authority, but political violence had now become an accepted instrument in disputes among magistrates, senators, and popular leaders. By 121 BCE, the Republican framework had endured its first major violent test. The murders of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus marked the beginning of a period in which political contests increasingly relied on coercion and force. This normalization of lethal intervention undermined confidence in legal procedures and reinforced the reliance of political actors on personal alliances and extralegal support. As the social and economic pressures that had prompted the Gracchus reforms continued, military loyalty emerged as the next decisive factor in maintaining influence. Control of armed forces, initially a provincial concern, would soon intersect with political authority, accelerating the pathway toward civil conflict. The Gracchus period established a new precedent in Roman politics. Institutional procedures were no longer sufficient to resolve disputes, and the legitimacy of political violence became codified in practice if not in law. These developments did not immediately produce full-scale civil war, but they created the conditions in which military loyalty and personal command would eclipse legal authority. In the years that followed, Rome's political landscape would be shaped as much by armed force as by legislative action, setting the stage for the Republic's gradual destabilization over the subsequent decades. Rome's legions were no longer citizens in arms, they were clients under command. In 107 BCE, Gaius Marius, elected consul for the first time, initiated reforms that transformed the Roman military from a citizen militia into a professional, career-based force. Traditionally, military service had been limited to property-owning citizens, ensuring that soldiers had both the means and a personal stake in defending their farms and communities. Archaeological evidence, including uniformity in legionary equipment and armor found at sites such as Numantia and subsequent campaigns in North Africa, indicates that Marius standardized weapons and training, making legions more cohesive and mobile. Literary accounts, particularly Plutarch's biography of Marius, detail the removal of property qualifications, allowing landless citizens, known as capitancy, to enlist. This reform created a new class of soldiers whose loyalty was owed directly to their commanding generals rather than to the Senate or Roman state. Marius' reforms also embedded a system of reward and dependency. Soldiers were promised land allotments and pensions upon discharge, creating a personal relationship between veteran and general. Epigraphic records and later legal references, such as those preserved in the Lex Julia Municipalis, confirm the formalization of these settlement grants. As a result, successful military command became not only a path to honor and influence but also a means of direct political leverage. Commanders could cultivate a base of loyal veterans whose social and economic well-being depended on their continued support. Over time, this relationship shifted the balance of power within the Republic, as generals with personal armies could challenge political rivals or the authority of the Senate itself. The professionalization of the army also had systemic consequences for Republican governance. Marius himself held an unprecedented 7 consulships between 107 and 86 BCE, often through extraordinary elections prompted by emergencies such as the Jugurthine War. Each term reinforced the precedent that exceptional military leadership could justify repeated constitutional breaches. Historians such as Appian note that Marius' repeated elections and accumulation of imperium weakened the institutional principle of annual magistracies. Control over professional troops gave generals the means to influence electoral outcomes and suppress opposition, eroding the traditional checks and balances of the Republic. The new structure of the army reshaped military culture. Loyalty was increasingly personal and contingent, rather than civic. Training and organizational reforms standardized combat techniques, but the social composition of the legions created a hierarchy of patronage. Soldiers relied on their generals for promotion, supplies, and land, fostering dependence that extended beyond the battlefield into political life. Archaeological evidence from legionary camps and fortified positions demonstrates the scale and permanence of these units, reflecting the long-term commitment of soldiers to centralized command. This concentration of military power in individual hands foreshadowed the civil conflicts that would dominate the late Republic. The reform also altered Rome's capacity to wage war abroad. Professional legions could be deployed for extended campaigns, as seen in the Cimbric War and other northern operations. Standardized training, uniform equipment, and experienced veterans allowed Rome to project force across Europe and North Africa more efficiently than ever before. At the same time, the reliance on personal loyalty made armies a domestic political instrument. Generals could deploy forces not only to fight foreign enemies but also to assert authority within Italy itself, creating the conditions for armed confrontation between competing leaders. By the end of Marius' reforms, the Roman army had become both a tool of imperial expansion and a mechanism for internal political leverage. Citizens who once served briefly and returned to independent farms now depended on military service as a path to security and advancement. Generals controlled the means of that advancement, embedding military power within the structure of elite competition. The Republic's political institutions were not equipped to manage this concentration of armed authority, setting a precedent for the personal armies that would dominate Roman politics in the following decades. Civil conflict was no longer hypothetical. It had become a structural possibility inherent in the design of Rome's professional military system. As generals gained personal armies loyal to their command, the next stage of political destabilization emerged. Power increasingly depended on the ability to mobilize armed forces rather than solely on electoral or legislative achievement. In this environment, rivalry among Rome's elite was destined to escalate from competition in the forum to confrontation on the battlefield, paving the way for the civil wars that would define the late Republic. Rome won the social war, but lost control of its political balance. Between 91 and 88 BCE, the Italian allies, or Socii, initiated a widespread rebellion against Roman authority, demanding full citizenship and equal political rights. The causes of the conflict were structural as much as political. Centuries of military obligation without commensurate enfranchisement had created systemic inequality. Archaeological evidence from central Italy, including layers of destruction at towns in Samnium and Apulia, corroborates literary accounts from Appian and Livy, showing the war's intensity and geographical spread. Rome mobilized multiple legions, relying on both citizen soldiers and loyal Italian contingents, demonstrating the growing integration of allies into the military system established by the Marian reforms. In response to the uprising, the Senate and magistrates enacted significant legal measures. The Lex Julia of 90 BCE granted Roman citizenship to Italian communities that remained loyal or surrendered early. The Lex Placia Papiria, passed shortly thereafter, extended similar rights to those who completed military service for Rome during the war. These laws created an unprecedented expansion of the electorate, incorporating hundreds of thousands of new citizens into Rome's political assemblies. Literary sources such as Dionysius of Halicarnassus emphasize that the sudden enlargement of the citizen body disrupted traditional voting blocks, making elections more unpredictable and intensifying elite competition for influence. The military dimension of the social war also transformed domestic politics. Commanders such as Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla gained prominence through extraordinary military success, achieving victories against well-organized Italian forces. Archaeological surveys of battlefields and fortified positions in Samnium suggest systematic siege and counter-siege operations, reflecting the scale and intensity of the campaigns. Sulla, in particular, emerged as a formidable military leader whose loyalty from veteran legions would later enable his decisive intervention in Roman politics. The war demonstrated that military authority could be leveraged directly for political advantage, reinforcing the link between armed command and personal power. The social war also had unintended consequences for social cohesion. While Rome succeeded in suppressing resistance militarily, the legal enfranchisement of allies generated friction within the traditional citizen electorate. Established families faced a radically expanded voting population, undermining the influence of long-standing senatorial and equestrian elites. Assemblies became more complex and harder to control, while popular tribunes and ambitious politicians sought to harness the votes of newly enfranchised Italians to advance careers. The structural integration of former rebels into civic life created opportunities for reform and factional rivalry, heightening the potential for internal conflict. Economically, the social war placed additional strain on Italy. Mobilization required extensive provisioning, and destruction of farmland in contested regions reduced local productivity. Epigraphic evidence and coin hoards indicate that the Roman state deployed emergency measures, including loans and tax deferments, to maintain military readiness. These economic pressures reinforced the reliance of commanders on personal loyalty, as soldiers increasingly expected tangible rewards for service. This linkage between military achievement and material benefit amplified the political significance of individual generals, further destabilizing republican norms. By the conclusion of the social war in 88 BCE, Rome had formally extended citizenship to its Italian allies, achieving the primary political objective that had motivated the rebellion. Yet the integration of these new citizens created structural instability within the Republic. Electoral dynamics were transformed, elite competition intensified, and political disputes increasingly intersected with military authority. The social war thus marked both a military victory and a profound reorganization of the Roman state, setting the stage for subsequent confrontations between ambitious generals and the Senate. The expansion of citizenship collided with personal ambition at the highest level, creating a dynamic in which armed authority would become the decisive instrument of political power. In 88 BCE, a Roman general turned his army against Rome itself. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, recently appointed to command the war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, faced an unprecedented political challenge. The popular tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus, supported by Gaius Marius and his allies, had orchestrated the reassignment of the Mithridatic command to Marius, circumventing the traditional senatorial and electoral processes. Sulla interpreted this as a direct affront to his authority and the established military hierarchy. According to Appian, he responded by taking the extraordinary step of marching his loyal legions from Campania directly into the city of Rome, a move that had no precedent in Republican history and violated centuries of legal and religious norms governing military conduct within Italy. The march itself produced immediate institutional shock. The presence of armed legions within the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, challenged the very conception of civic order. Soldiers, loyal primarily to Sulla, occupied the Forum, patrolled major thoroughfares, and effectively controlled the assemblies. Contemporary accounts describe senators fleeing, tribunician authority suspended, and political procedures abandoned under duress. Archaeological evidence, including destruction layers and urban rebuilding records from the late 1st century BCE, corroborates reports of skirmishes and unrest in central Rome during this period. The unprecedented nature of the march demonstrated that legal and constitutional authority alone could no longer guarantee control over the city when confronted by organized military force. Sulla's actions were rooted in structural and institutional dynamics as much as personal ambition. The expansion of Rome's citizen body, professionalization of the army under Marius, and the political polarization emerging from the social war had created a context in which military command conferred both political legitimacy and coercive power. Sulla's legions were no longer instruments of purely civic duty. They were politically mobilized actors whose loyalty was to a commander rather than to Rome as a state. Literary sources, including Plutarch and Velleius Paterculus, emphasized that the soldiers' obedience to Sulla was motivated by promises of land, pay, and continued service, highlighting the linkage between military reward and political leverage established by earlier reforms. The consequences of the march were immediate and systemic. Sulla successfully forced the reversal of Sulpicius legislation, reinstating his command against Mithridates. Yet the action also permanently eroded the long-standing taboo against the use of armed force within the city. The Republic had previously relied on norms, civic religion, and collective consent to regulate the conduct of magistrates and armies. By demonstrating that a general could impose his will with legions in Rome, Sulla set a precedent for subsequent military interventions, establishing a causal pathway from political dispute to armed confrontation. This realignment of power relations transformed both perception and practice. Generals became decisive political actors, and the mechanisms of law could be overridden by force. The march also intensified factional polarization among Rome's elite. Marius and his supporters fled the city, rallying allies in southern Italy, while Sulla consolidated control over the Senate and magistracies sympathetic to his position. Electoral and legislative authority became contingent on military backing rather than deliberative consensus. The institutional rupture created by Sulla's occupation exposed vulnerabilities in the republic system. Assemblies could be coerced, magistracies could be manipulated under duress, and senatorial debate could be rendered ineffective in the presence of armed power. These developments laid the foundation for cyclical civil conflict, in which each faction's attempt to enforce legality could be countered through military mobilization. Strategically, Sulla's intervention foreshadowed the pattern of subsequent civil wars. Control of the army became the primary instrument of political negotiation, supplanting traditional mechanisms of legislative compromise and magistrate-led mediation. The Republic's political culture, which had previously emphasized adherence to precedent and restraint, now accommodated armed coercion as a legitimate tactic. Archaeological evidence from Roman fortifications and battlefield logistics indicates that Sulla maintained a disciplined, highly organized military presence within Italy, further demonstrating that political objectives could be achieved through controlled deployment of force rather than purely through civic or legal channels. By the end of 88 BCE, Sulla had successfully reclaimed command in the east, but the social and political implications extended far beyond the Mithridatic campaign. The march of legions into Rome transformed the Republic's understanding of authority, linking armed power directly to political legitimacy. From this moment onward, civil war became an expected, even routine feature of Roman politics. Military loyalty now overshadowed institutional process, establishing a structural condition in which personal armies would repeatedly challenge republican norms and drive the state toward prolonged internal conflict. Order returned to Rome, but at the cost of thousands of lives. Following his decisive victories in the Civil War, Lucius Cornelius Sulla assumed the office of dictator in 82 BCE with extraordinary powers to restore the republic. Sulla's dictatorship was formally justified as a measure to re-establish constitutional order, but in practice, it relied on coercion, violence, and structural reorganization. Literary sources, including Plutarch and Appian, emphasized that Sulla's rule was unprecedented in both scope and methodology. The most notable instrument of enforcement was the system of proscriptions, publicly published lists of political enemies whose lives, property, and social status were forfeit. These measures targeted senators, equestrians, and former allies of Marius, producing an immediate climate of fear that extended through urban and rural Italy. Epigraphic records and surviving inscriptions corroborate large-scale confiscations and redistribution of property during Sulla's tenure. Land and wealth from proscribed individuals were auctioned or granted to veteran soldiers, reinforcing the precedent of rewarding loyalty through tangible material benefit. In addition, Sulla enacted reforms to consolidate senatorial authority. The Lex Cornelia de Magistratibus and related legislation expanded the Senate's membership, formalized cursus honorum requirements, and restricted the tribunician veto. These measures were designed to strengthen institutional control and reduce populist influence. However, despite these legal reforms, the underlying precedent established by Sulla, that military success and personal authority could override established constitutional norms, remained irreversible. The scale of the proscriptions was extensive. Estimates from contemporary accounts suggest that several hundred citizens were executed, while many more were exiled or forced into hiding. Violence was both systematic and symbolic, targeting prominent families and undermining potential opposition. Appian notes that public auctions of confiscated property not only redistributed wealth but also served as a warning to those contemplating resistance. Archaeological findings, including records of abandoned estates in Campania and Latium, confirm widespread disruption to local landholding patterns and civic life. These actions created a structural consolidation of power, embedding political compliance within patterns of economic dependence. Sulla's reforms also restructured the political framework to reinforce elite control. The tribunician office, traditionally a tool for representing popular interests, was curtailed. Tribunes could no longer initiate legislation without senatorial approval, and their capacity to obstruct magistrates was limited. The Senate's role in legislative and judicial oversight was strengthened, aiming to restore the republican hierarchy disrupted by the Gracchi, Marius, and the Social War. These legal adjustments reflect a deliberate attempt to recalibrate authority within traditional republican institutions. Yet the reliance on extraordinary power and extralegal coercion illustrated the tension between constitutional restoration and the exercise of force as a political instrument. Despite the ostensible restoration of order, Sulla's dictatorship had long-term structural consequences. The normalization of lethal political purges created a precedent for subsequent leaders, demonstrating that armed intervention could achieve both political and economic objectives. Soldiers and veterans were increasingly positioned as instruments of political leverage, tying military loyalty directly to the fortunes of individual commanders. This dynamic undermined the Republic's capacity for self-regulation, as assemblies and magistracies could be coerced or bypassed through force, while legal authority became contingent on personal and military support. Sulla retired voluntarily in 79 BCE, ostensibly returning the Republic to senatorial governance. However, the structures he left behind were inherently unstable. The Senate retained formal authority, but the underlying dependence on military enforcement persisted. Generals now had a clear template for consolidating power: command armies, suppress opposition, and implement political reforms backed by coercion. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that many of Sulla's veterans received land settlements, cementing personal loyalty networks that could be mobilized for future conflicts. While constitutional mechanisms remained on paper, the Republic had been transformed into a system where political stability depended on force as much as law. By the end of Sulla's retirement, Rome had achieved temporary order, but at a structural cost. The precedent of dictatorship through military power had been firmly established, and political violence had become normalized. Senators could no longer assume that constitutional forms alone would preserve authority, while ambitious generals now had a replicable model for seizing control. The Republic, though restored in appearance, was structurally incapable of enduring long-term stability. Civil conflict, previously exceptional, had become a recurring feature of Roman political life, laying the groundwork for the subsequent confrontations that would culminate in the late Republic's major civil wars. Sulla fixed the Republic, only long enough to break it again. Following Sulla's voluntary retirement in 79 BCE, the Republic appeared to have returned to senatorial control, but the foundations of his settlement quickly eroded. Legal restrictions on tribunes, the reassertion of senatorial authority, and limitations on magistracies were designed to prevent the resurgence of popular factionalism. Yet these reforms were structurally vulnerable. Tribunes and other popular leaders, motivated by lingering grievances from the social war and the proscriptions, gradually reasserted influence through legislation, urban mobilization, and public assemblies. Literary sources, including Cicero and Appian, indicate that the Senate's authority was repeatedly challenged, while street violence and political intimidation became increasingly common mechanisms for asserting influence. The mechanisms intended to restore stability were undermined by persistent socioeconomic and military pressures. Landless veterans from Sulla's campaigns continued to depend on patronage, creating networks of loyalty that could be mobilized independently of formal political channels. At the same time, Italy's expanded citizen body, granted enfranchisement during and after the social war, introduced unpredictable dynamics into elections. Assemblies became arenas of intense competition, where new citizens could be courted through legislation, grain distributions, or popular agitation. Archaeological evidence, including the proliferation of urban insulae and grain storage facilities, suggests that these demographic pressures were accompanied by structural strains on the city's infrastructure, reinforcing the political volatility of the period. Political violence reemerged as a tool of negotiation and enforcement. Incidents such as the street confrontations of 77 BCE, when armed factions clashed during elections and legislative sessions, illustrate that coercion had become normalized. Literary accounts detail how ex-consuls and tribunes, previously constrained by law, mobilized armed supporters to enforce political objectives. The Republic's institutions, designed to mediate disputes through procedure and precedent, proved insufficient to manage these challenges. Authority became increasingly contingent upon personal networks, militia loyalty, and the capacity to mobilize force, a structural continuation of patterns established under Sulla. Military dynamics further weakened Sulla's settlement. Generals retained command over legions whose allegiance was personal rather than institutional. In provinces such as Hispania, Gaul, and the Eastern Territories, commanders exercised de facto autonomy, leveraging veteran loyalty and local resources to enhance their political influence. Pompey, emerging as a dominant figure in the aftermath of Sulla's campaigns, exemplified this trend. His successes against insurgents and pirates in the Mediterranean demonstrated that military achievement could translate directly into political authority, independent of the Senate's formal approval. This pattern revealed that Sulla's reforms had failed to constrain the increasing centrality of generals in Roman political life. The breakdown of Sullan reforms was compounded by the reassertion of populist strategies. Tribunes of the plebs, exploiting weaknesses in legislative oversight, sponsored laws that expanded social benefits, regulated taxation, and sought land distributions for veterans. These measures directly challenged the Senate's restrictive agenda, provoking tension and occasional confrontation. Literary sources highlight the repeated failure of senatorial decrees to enforce compliance, illustrating that institutional authority alone could no longer govern a politically mobilized and militarized society. Political negotiation increasingly relied on the threat or use of force, creating a cycle in which reform provoked opposition, opposition provoked violence, and violence reshaped law. By the mid-70s BCE, Rome's political environment was characterized by a delicate balance between elite factions, urban popular forces, and military power. The Senate's authority remained formal but had lost practical control over political outcomes. Generals operating in the provinces, such as Pompey, leveraged their armies and personal influence to project authority beyond Italy, setting a precedent for extraterritorial political intervention. The combination of legal erosion, personal ambition, and military autonomy rendered the republic structurally unstable. Sulla's settlement, intended as a permanent restoration, had instead created conditions in which political norms were easily subverted. By the end of this period, power had shifted decisively toward generals operating beyond Italy, whose military achievements conferred political legitimacy in the absence of effective institutional checks. The breakdown of Sulla's reforms revealed that structural weaknesses, expanded citizenship, professionalized armies, and elite competition, could not be contained by legal or procedural measures alone. Civil conflict, previously episodic, was now embedded within the republic's systemic dynamics, laying the groundwork for the confrontations between Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar that would dominate the next decades. Rome rewarded success, even when it defied tradition. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey, rose to prominence during a period when military achievement became the primary avenue for political power. Beginning in 67 BCE, Pompey was granted extraordinary imperium to eradicate piracy in the Mediterranean under the Lex Gabinia. Unlike traditional commands limited to provincial theaters or annual terms, this grant extended his authority across the entire sea and for an unprecedented duration. Ancient sources, including Appian and Plutarch, emphasize that the scope of this assignment defied republican precedent, effectively placing the Roman navy and coastal territories under the control of a single commander. The grant reflected the Senate's recognition that conventional procedures were insufficient to address crises of scale, while simultaneously demonstrating that extraordinary authority could be politically normalized through successful execution. Pompey's campaign against piracy achieved rapid and decisive results. Within a few months, piracy along the Italian and eastern Mediterranean coasts was virtually eradicated, allowing secure maritime trade, grain shipments, and communication lines. Archaeological evidence from port fortifications and naval bases in the Aegean and Sicily supports contemporary accounts of organized, systematic anti-piracy operations. The effectiveness of his command enhanced Pompey's reputation and set a precedent for delegating extensive powers to a single individual, particularly when the Senate perceived existing structures as inadequate. Success, rather than tradition, became the metric by which extraordinary authority was justified. Following this achievement, Pompey received another extraordinary command in 66 BCE to conduct operations against Mithridates VI of Pontus, concluding the Third Mithridatic War by 63 BCE. His victories combined conventional military strategy with diplomatic settlements, including client kings and administrative reorganization of eastern provinces. Literary accounts highlight Pompey's ability to exercise discretion and autonomy in provincial governance, further consolidating his personal authority. Epigraphic records indicate land distributions to veterans and financial settlements that strengthened loyalty networks and reinforced the connection between military achievement and political influence. Pompey's campaigns thus illustrated that the accumulation of personal authority could be formalized through extraordinary commands sanctioned by the Republic, even as these exceptions eroded normative procedures. The broader political implications of Pompey's extraordinary commands were profound. By granting singular control to a general, the Senate effectively acknowledged the limitations of collective Republican administration in addressing strategic crises. Authority increasingly derived from demonstrated competence and military results rather than from office-holding, electoral tradition, or institutional precedent. As a result, generals could convert battlefield success into enduring political influence, leveraging veteran loyalty, client networks, and public acclaim to dominate civic decision-making. This pattern reinforced the shift identified during the Marian and Sullan periods. Military power, rather than constitutional office, had become the decisive mechanism of political leverage. The normalization of exceptional authority also reshaped Rome's elite competition. Pompey's autonomy challenged the Senate's ability to coordinate policy across provinces and to supervise magistrates effectively. His control over military and logistical resources allowed him to bypass traditional senatorial oversight, creating structural tension between institutional governance and personal command. Literary sources, including Cicero's letters, describe attempts by the Senate and rival leaders to influence or constrain Pompey, but the practical limits of their authority were evident. Extraordinary commands had become not merely permissible but politically necessary, effectively recalibrating the balance of power in favor of successful generals. By the end of these campaigns, Pompey's rise exemplified the interdependence of military glory and political consolidation. The Senate's reliance on his competence set a precedent for empowering individuals with extraordinary authority during crises, reinforcing the trend whereby generals could operate independently of traditional Republican constraints. This environment incentivized ambitious leaders to seek military commands as a path to political dominance, further embedding armed force within the architecture of power. The Republic, though formally intact, had created structural conditions in which personal armies and exceptional authority could supersede legal and institutional norms. Pompey's experience also highlighted the feedback loop between military success and political expectation. Extraordinary commands generated prestige, which translated into electoral and legislative influence, which in turn enabled further command opportunities. This cycle created systemic pressure. The Republic required effective generals for external security, yet granting them exceptional powers weakened the institutional framework designed to constrain political competition. Military glory demanded political consolidation, establishing a precedent that Julius Caesar and other ambitious commanders would exploit in the coming decades. By 62 BCE, the integration of extraordinary military authority into Roman political practice had been fully normalized. Success now justified exceptions to republican norms, and generals with personal armies could operate on a scale previously unimaginable within the constraints of traditional governance. This structural transformation of authority, military competence as the primary source of political legitimacy, would shape the late Republic, establishing the conditions under which civil war became both foreseeable and inevitable. By 60 BCE, Rome could no longer resolve elite competition through law alone. The Republican political system, designed for a smaller city-state and limited citizen body, faced unprecedented structural strain. The Senate, dominated by conservative optimates, resisted measures demanded by generals returning from extended military campaigns. Pompey the Great, having achieved sweeping victories in the East between 66 and 62 BCE, sought ratification of his settlements in Asia Minor and secure land allocations for his veterans. The Senate's reluctance reflected both ideological opposition and the institutional challenge of accommodating a rapidly expanding citizenry. Simultaneously, Marcus Licinius Crassus pressed for relief and protection for equestrian tax contractors, publicani, in Asia, whose financial claims had created tension with senatorial oversight. Gaius Julius Caesar, newly returned from his governorship in Hispania Ulterior and elected consul for 59 BCE, required backing for a provincial command that would provide political leverage and military resources. Collectively, these pressures highlighted the incapacity of traditional mechanisms, elections, senatorial debate, and legal precedent to mediate elite competition effectively. The deadlock was rooted in structural rather than personal factors. The Republic had expanded far beyond the administrative and civic structures originally designed for governance. Military commanders now returned from years-long campaigns with loyal veterans dependent on land settlements and monetary rewards, creating bargaining power that the Senate was ill-equipped to regulate. Archaeological surveys from veteran colonies in southern Italy and inscriptions recording land distributions reveal the practical difficulties of reconciling expectations with senatorial authority. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and Cicero, emphasize that ordinary legislative procedures proved insufficient. Assemblies could be swayed by personal influence, vetoes could obstruct policy, and senatorial resolutions often lacked enforcement mechanisms. The cumulative effect was institutional paralysis. The political deadlock also reflected competing elite agendas intersecting with popular demands. Urban plebeians, indebted smallholders, and enfranchised Italians created a constituency whose needs were structurally embedded within the system. Senators' attempts to block reform generated friction not only with returning generals but also with the broader citizen body. Epigraphic evidence from Roman voting districts suggests increased mobilization of clients and supporters, reinforcing the political weight of military veterans and wealthy patrons. This dynamic transformed public assemblies into arenas where coercion, negotiation, and spectacle were as influential as law or precedent. Republican institutions were no longer sufficient to mediate social and political pressures without resorting to extraordinary measures. The constraints of traditional governance were exacerbated by personal power and military resources. Pompey's army, though technically under imperium only in the east, created implicit leverage in Rome. His veterans could be mobilized for political support if necessary, while his reputation as a conqueror demanded recognition. Crassus' financial influence provided resources to reward allies and sponsor legislation. Caesar's popularity among veterans and urban populations enhanced his negotiating position. These intersecting networks, military, economic, and civic, illustrate that authority in the late Republic had become multifactorial. Legal and procedural tools, once sufficient to resolve disputes, were increasingly inadequate for managing elite competition. The structural breakdown manifested in repeated legislative obstruction. Pompey's requests for ratification of Eastern settlements were delayed or denied, provoking frustration among veterans and allies. Crassus' fiscal concerns went largely unaddressed, creating pressure on the equestrian order and further eroding senatorial cohesion. Caesar's ambitions to secure a provincial command capable of establishing political leverage could not be satisfied through normal electoral mechanisms alone. Literary accounts note that these cumulative frustrations drove informal negotiation and private arrangement, as each actor sought a solution outside institutional channels. The emergence of the triumvirate was thus a response to systemic blockage rather than personal conspiracy, reflecting the structural incapacity of the Republican framework to accommodate extraordinary competition. By mid-60s BCE, the combination of military authority, economic leverage, and civic influence had created a new political environment. Normal channels of legislation and debate were insufficient to address overlapping demands and competing interests. Assemblies, magistracies, and senatorial oversight could no longer enforce compliance or reconcile competing agendas. The deadlock illustrated that Republican institutions, designed for a smaller and more homogeneous polity, were fundamentally inadequate to manage a state whose scale, military demands, and socio-economic complexity had increased exponentially. In this context, informal alliance became the only viable solution for ambitious leaders seeking to achieve their objectives. In response, Rome's most powerful men, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, recognized that their individual goals were achievable only through coordinated effort. The triumvirate, formalized through private agreement rather than public decree, represented a structural adaptation to institutional failure. Each member brought a distinct source of influence. Pompey commanded military prestige and veterans, Crassus controlled wealth and financial networks, and Caesar possessed civic popularity and legislative skill. Collectively, they could bypass senatorial obstruction, mobilize resources, and enact policies that individual officeholders could not achieve alone. This alliance, though informal, exemplified how the breakdown of republican procedures necessitated new mechanisms for exercising authority in a highly competitive political environment. By the conclusion of this period, the political deadlock had not only facilitated the formation of the triumvirate, but also normalized the principle that informal arrangements among elites could substitute for formal republican processes. The structural failure of the state, rather than the ambitions of any individual, had produced a system in which military achievement, financial power, and popular support converged to redefine political authority. The stage was now set for the full militarization of politics, in which private alliance networks and personal armies would dominate legislative and electoral life, and the republic's traditional mechanisms would increasingly yield to force, negotiation, and extraordinary influence. Rome still had laws, but power now operated outside them. In 60 BCE, three of the republic's most influential figures, Gaius Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, formed an unprecedented informal alliance known to history as the First Triumvirate. Unlike formal magistracies or senatorial commissions, this arrangement functioned through coordinated elections, shared legislative priorities, and reciprocal patronage. Its formation was a direct response to the structural paralysis of republican institutions, the Senate's obstruction of reforms, and the inability of traditional electoral mechanisms to accommodate overlapping ambitions made private cooperation a practical necessity. Literary sources, including Plutarch and Appian, emphasize that the alliance was understood contemporaneously as extralegal, yet effective in achieving objectives unattainable through ordinary procedure. The triumvirate's immediate purpose was to secure mutual political goals. Caesar, elected consul for 59 BCE, needed approval for a provincial command that would provide both military resources and political leverage. Pompey sought ratification of land settlements for his veterans following his eastern campaigns, while Crassus demanded financial relief for equestrian tax contractors in Asia. Acting in concert, the three coordinated votes, supported allies for magistracies, and applied direct pressure on assemblies to enact their legislation. Epigraphic evidence, including inscriptions documenting veteran land allocations in Campania, confirms the practical outcomes of this alliance. These measures illustrate how informal coordination among elites could achieve substantive policy goals while maintaining the outward appearance of legal and constitutional procedure. Caesar's consulship was central to the triumvirate's functioning. Agrarian reforms passed under his leadership redistributed land to Pompey's veterans and addressed debts and claims associated with Crassus' financial network. Literary accounts highlight that enforcement often relied on intimidation of senators, public demonstrations, and the mobilization of supportive urban and provincial populations. While the Senate formally approved legislation, the process circumvented traditional deliberation and debate, hollowing the authority of the institution. The result was a model of governance in which legality was preserved in form, but substantive decision-making resided within the private coordination of three powerful individuals. The mechanisms of the triumvirate relied on a combination of political, military, and financial leverage. Caesar brought popularity among the citizenry and veterans, coupled with legislative skill and control over civic assemblies. Pompey contributed military prestige and a loyal veteran army, whose support could be deployed implicitly to influence political outcomes in Rome. Crassus supplied wealth and patronage networks capable of securing loyalty among equestrians, urban clients, and provincial elites. The interlocking strengths of the three men created a system in which formal institutions were subordinated to coordinated personal power. This structural arrangement allowed the triumvirate to circumvent republican norms without openly abolishing them. The alliance also normalized a new form of political negotiation: private agreement as a substitute for constitutional procedure. Elections, legislation, and administrative appointments became instruments of negotiated cooperation rather than independent exercise of magistracies. Literary sources emphasize that senators and tribunes were often compelled to acquiesce to triumvirate priorities, with resistance limited by the implicit threat of political or military counteraction. Epigraphic and archaeological records, including urban land redistributions and municipal dedications, demonstrate the tangible outcomes of these coordinated actions, confirming that personal networks could produce effective governance even when traditional legal and procedural frameworks were weakened. Importantly, the triumvirate did not eliminate formal republican structures. Consular authority, senatorial decrees, and assemblies remained intact, preserving the appearance of legality. However, the locus of power had shifted from institutional procedures to private coordination among elite actors. This duality, formal legality combined with informal execution, underscored the broader structural transformation of the late Republic. Authority was increasingly determined by the capacity to marshal resources, command loyalty, and manipulate political processes, rather than by office-holding alone. By consolidating political security, the triumvirate allowed its members to pursue personal agendas with unprecedented latitude. Caesar, having secured the consulship and support for his provincial command, turned his focus toward military conquest, setting the stage for the Gallic campaigns that would elevate his political and military authority. Pompey and Crassus similarly leveraged the alliance to advance their respective objectives, reinforcing the principle that elite cooperation was essential to overcoming systemic gridlock. The formal institutions of the Republic survived in appearance, but substantive decision-making had shifted decisively to networks of personal influence. The formation and function of the First Triumvirate thus represent a critical structural shift in Roman politics. It illustrates how informal alliances could substitute for constitutional mechanisms when institutional frameworks were incapable of mediating elite competition. The triumvirate also established a precedent. Political objectives could be achieved through coordinated personal networks, rather than through procedural adherence or collective deliberation. With legality preserved in form but hollowed in substance, the Republic entered a period in which military power, financial resources, and personal loyalty dictated political outcomes, setting the stage for the civil wars of the late 50s and 40s BC. In January 49 BCE, legality ended at the banks of a small Italian river. Gaius Julius Caesar faced a legal and political dilemma as his command in Gaul approached its official conclusion. Under Roman law, a provincial governor could not bring his army into Italy while seeking a political office. Doing so was considered a violation of Lex Cornelia and centuries of republican precedent. The Senate, increasingly dominated by conservative optimates and influenced by Pompey, demanded that Caesar relinquish his army before standing for consul or pursuing further political ambition. Pompey, who had been appointed sole consul in 52 BCE and emerged as the de facto protector of senatorial authority, aligned with these measures, framing compliance as essential for the preservation of the Republic. The constitutional conflict centered not on ambition alone but on the legal mechanics of command, imperium, and civil authority, which were now at a breaking point. The Senate's formal response, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, authorized magistrates to use force to protect the state. While this decree had precedent, its application against Caesar's own army marked an escalation in Roman constitutional practice. Literary sources, including Suetonius, Plutarch, and Appian, emphasized that the decree codified an extraordinary measure. Legal authority was now directly linked to the threat of military action. Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon River, the boundary separating his provincial command from Italy proper, represented a deliberate breach of law. Contemporary accounts emphasize that the act was premeditated and calculated, intended to secure his position and preserve both political leverage and personal security. Crossing the Rubicon was not simply a symbolic gesture. It was a structural challenge to republican authority. The legal stakes of this crisis were immediate and systemic. By entering Italy with an armed force, Caesar directly undermined the Senate's ability to enforce its decrees. The Republic's traditional mechanisms for resolving disputes, assemblies, magistracies, and legal adjudication, relied on voluntary compliance and procedural respect. Caesar's actions demonstrated that these mechanisms were insufficient when faced with a general who commanded loyalty from a professional army. Epigraphic and literary evidence confirms that Caesar's veterans were already bound by promises of land, spoils, and political advantage, creating a force independent of the state's legal apparatus. The collapse of legal authority was thus not a momentary breakdown but a reflection of deeper structural vulnerabilities. Pompey's response illustrates the entrenchment of these structural pressures. As the Senate's primary military representative, he began organizing forces in Italy and the provinces, leveraging his consular authority and networks of influence to counter Caesar's advance. Literary accounts describe rapid mobilization of senatorial forces across northern Italy, including recruitment of veteran units and local militias. The parallel escalation of military and legal authority shows that the late Republic had reached a point where constitutional measures alone could not resolve disputes. The conflict between personal imperium, military loyalty, and legal obligation revealed the systemic fragility of Republican governance. The Rubicon crisis also underscores the interplay between personal command and institutional constraint. Caesar's Gallic armies, structured as professional legions loyal to their general rather than the state, provided him with leverage that previous Republican leaders could not exercise. Veterans' dependence on their commander for land, pay, and political protection created a dynamic in which the Senate's authority became contingent upon compliance with military power. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions recording veteran settlements, supports the conclusion that loyalty to individual commanders had eclipsed formal Republican institutions in determining outcomes. Legal norms were preserved in rhetoric, but the practical ability to enforce them had eroded. Once Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the political and legal order in Rome was effectively suspended. The Republic's constitutional framework could no longer regulate the actions of its most powerful generals. Assemblies and magistracies continued to function, but their decisions were subordinated to the dynamics of military authority. Literary sources emphasize that Caesar's advance prompted a near-immediate flight of Pompey and senatorial forces to the south and eventually to Greece, highlighting how the collapse of law translated directly into the redistribution of strategic power. The Rubicon crisis illustrates that civil war in Rome was not simply the result of personal ambition but of structural transformations in authority, military organization, and institutional enforcement. By the end of January 49 BCE, the stage was set for a full-scale civil war that would reshape the Republic. Legal norms were violated not for dramatic effect but because they had become structurally ineffective in mediating elite competition and commanding compliance. Caesar's crossing demonstrated that personal armies, professionalized over decades, could override centuries of constitutional practice. The conflict that followed was therefore the inevitable consequence of systemic weaknesses in Republican governance, where law, tradition, and institutional authority could no longer contain the ambitions of generals with autonomous military power. Rome's fate had shifted irreversibly, and the resolution of disputes would now depend on force rather than procedure et farcilis. Rome decided its future on foreign soil. Following Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in January 49 BCE, the Republican conflict rapidly expanded beyond Italy, encompassing the Mediterranean and its provinces. Pompey, confronted with Caesar's swift advance, evacuated Rome and regrouped in southern Italy before crossing the Adriatic into Greece, bringing with him a substantial portion of the senatorial and equestrian forces. Literary sources, including Appian, Plutarch, and Caesar's own Commentarii de Bello Civili, indicate that Pompey's strategy relied on leveraging geographic distance, local allegiances, and control of eastern grain and naval resources to prolong resistance. The Italian peninsula itself fell quickly under Caesar's control, illustrating both his operational agility and the fragility of Republican enforcement mechanisms when challenged by a commander with professionalized legions. Simultaneously, Caesar extended operations into the wider Mediterranean theater. In 49 BCE, campaigns in Hispania and the western provinces secured loyalty among veteran units and reinforced Caesar's lines of communication. Archaeological evidence, including temporary fortifications and coinage struck to pay troops, confirms the logistical sophistication of these movements. By securing Spain, Caesar eliminated Pompeian supporters outside Italy and prevented the consolidation of reinforcements from Trans-Pyrenean territories. This early phase of the Mediterranean War demonstrated Caesar's capacity to coordinate simultaneous campaigns across multiple provinces, underscoring a new scale of military and political integration beyond traditional Republican control. Caesar's Italian advance also highlighted the intersection of military mobility and political authority. Cities along the Po Valley and the Apennine passes were secured largely without pitched battle, relying instead on local compliance, negotiation, and the implicit threat of military force. Epigraphic records reveal that settlements and municipal councils were reorganized under Caesar's influence, extending his control over civic administration while leaving formal Republican institutions nominally intact. This approach reinforced the structural shift in which effective power was derived from personal command and operational control, rather than electoral office or senatorial sanction. Caesar's methods exemplified the fusion of military efficiency with political strategy that characterized the late Republican civil wars. The culmination of Pompeian resistance occurred in Greece during the summer of 48 BCE at the Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar, commanding approximately 22,000 veteran legionaries, confronted Pompey's force of roughly 45,000, composed of mixed legions, auxiliaries, and allied contingents. Tactical analysis, corroborated by ancient sources and modern scholarship, highlights Caesar's innovative use of reserves and the concentration of force to exploit Pompey's overextended lines. Pompey's reliance on numerical superiority and traditional phalanx deployment proved insufficient against Caesar's disciplined legions and flexible command structure. The decisive engagement resulted in the rout of Pompeian forces and the flight of their leader, effectively ending organized Republican military opposition in the eastern provinces. Archaeological surveys of Thessalian battlefields provide material corroboration for troop movements, fortifications, and encampment locations, reinforcing the historical record. The broader Mediterranean consequences of the Pharsalus campaign were profound. Caesar's victory extended Roman authority into Greece, the eastern provinces, and across the Adriatic, while simultaneously destabilizing remaining Pompeian loyalists in Asia Minor and the Levant. Naval operations, particularly in the Adriatic and Ionian seas, ensured the security of supply lines and limited the capacity of Pompeian forces to regroup or receive reinforcements. Literary accounts detail the strategic and logistical coordination required to maintain simultaneous land and maritime operations, illustrating the expansion of civil war into an imperial-scale conflict. Rome, historically a Mediterranean power, now conducted its internal struggle across the entire region it had once dominated externally. Despite the magnitude of Caesar's success, structural instability persisted. The defeat of Pompey removed formal Republican opposition in the east, but the underlying dynamics of personal armies, regional loyalty, and extraordinary commands remained unresolved. Caesar's authority depended on the continued loyalty of veteran legions, whose service had become inseparable from political influence. Epigraphic and numismatic evidence indicates continued redistribution of land and resources to secure support, emphasizing that political control remained embedded in military capability. The Civil War had transformed from a contest between factions into a systemic reorganization of power across the Mediterranean, revealing that victory did not equate to institutional stability. By the end of 48 BCE, the Mediterranean War had decisively shifted the balance of power toward Caesar. The integration of Italy, Hispania, and the eastern provinces under his control exemplified a structural consolidation of authority unprecedented in Republican history. Yet the Republic's constitutional framework remained formally intact, creating a tension between de jure governance and de facto power. Caesar's campaigns demonstrated that military command, logistical coordination, and strategic initiative had become primary determinants of political authority. Victory had been achieved, but peace and governance required the continued management of systemic dependencies created by professional armies and regional loyalty networks. Caesar's triumph at Pharsalus thus marked a turning point in Roman history. Civil war had expanded into an imperial-scale operation, where the exercise of authority, allocation of resources, and enforcement of law were inseparable from military power. The defeat of Pompey's organized forces ended immediate Republican resistance in the east. Yet the structural dynamics that had produced the war, personal armies, extraordinary commands, and political networks operating outside formal institutions, remained in place. Rome's political trajectory was irrevocably altered, setting the stage for subsequent campaigns, consolidation of power, and the eventual transformation from republic to principate. Reform and domination advanced together. Following his decisive victories in the civil wars, Gaius Julius Caesar assumed control over Rome's political and administrative apparatus, implementing a range of reforms aimed at addressing systemic inefficiencies while simultaneously consolidating personal authority. Caesar's legislative program tackled long-standing economic, social, and administrative problems. Land redistribution for veterans, debt relief for urban citizens, and reorganization of municipal governance extended the state's capacity to integrate diverse populations. Epigraphic records from veteran colonies, inscriptions noting civic dedications, and contemporary accounts confirm these interventions were extensive and systematically applied. At the same time, these measures reinforced loyalty networks that bound citizens and military veterans to Caesar personally rather than to republican institutions. Caesar also undertook administrative reforms across Rome and the provinces. The central bureaucracy was strengthened, including clearer delineation of provincial governance, standardization of tax collection, and regulation of public works. Ancient sources, such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, document his supervision of municipal administration and the appointment of loyal deputies to key positions. These measures improved operational efficiency but also concentrated power in the hands of the dictator, further undermining traditional senatorial oversight. Administrative reform thus served a dual purpose: systemic improvement and consolidation of political control. Calendrical reform illustrates Caesar's ability to combine practical governance with symbolic authority. The introduction of the Julian calendar in 46 BCE standardized the Roman year, correcting seasonal drift and providing a reliable temporal framework for both civic and agricultural activities. Coinage and inscriptions commemorated this reform, signaling Caesar's authority over both civil and cosmic order. By embedding his name and reforms in publicly visible systems, he reinforced the perception that the republic structure now operated under his guidance. Literary sources emphasize that while the calendar reform resolved long-standing practical problems, it also symbolized the unprecedented scope of Caesar's authority. Caesar's accumulation of honors intensified elite unease. The Senate conferred extraordinary titles, including Dictator Perpetuo, while coinage and monuments emphasized his personal achievements. Records show that public recognition increasingly centered on Caesar rather than the institutions of the Republic. Such honors were legally permissible but symbolically challenged the Republic's historical balance of magistracies, collegiality, and annual office rotation. This concentration of power blurred the line between service to the state and personal dominion, heightening tensions among the conservative senatorial elite and fueling fears of monarchy. The structural effect of Caesar's reforms extended to Rome's legislative process. Assemblies and magistracies continued to function formally, but decisions increasingly reflected the influence of Caesar's personal authority. Legislative priorities, land allocations, debt relief, and public works were implemented under his oversight, creating a precedent in which policy enforcement depended on the sanction of a dominant individual rather than institutional mechanisms. Archaeological evidence of municipal reorganization and epigraphic records of veteran settlements corroborate the practical impact of this concentration of power on Roman civic life. Caesar's military authority remained a key factor in sustaining his political dominance. Veterans from the Gallic and civil campaigns retained loyalty to him, providing both implicit and explicit leverage over the city and provinces. This combination of administrative, legislative, and military control reinforced the perception that Caesar could govern independently of traditional republican checks and balances. The Republic, while formally intact, had been structurally altered to concentrate authority in a single actor, demonstrating the interplay between systemic reform and personal power consolidation. By the end of 45 BCE, Caesar's reforms had addressed multiple inefficiencies and stabilized governance after decades of civil war. Yet the methods by which these reforms were enacted, centralized oversight, concentration of honors, and reliance on personal loyalty, generated structural tension within the elite. Fear replaced opposition. Senators and magistrates were compelled to acquiesce to Caesar's authority, not solely because of legal compulsion, but because institutional enforcement had been subordinated to his personal control. The formal mechanisms of the Republic remained, but their functional capacity to limit individual dominance had been hollowed. In summary, Caesar's reforms exemplify the dual nature of late Republican transformation. Systemic problems were addressed through administrative, legislative, and practical measures, yet these same interventions reinforced an unprecedented concentration of personal power. Coinage, inscriptions, and Senate decrees attest to both the efficiency and the symbolic centralization achieved under Caesar. Reform and domination advanced in parallel, creating a political environment in which institutional authority was formally preserved but operationally dependent on the sanction of a single dominant individual. This structural reconfiguration set the stage for the final political crisis, demonstrating that legality alone could no longer restrain the ambitions of commanders who commanded both institutional compliance and personal loyalty. The Republic's defenders prepared to kill its ruler. By 44 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar's concentration of political, military, and administrative authority had generated profound anxiety among the senatorial elite. Long-standing cultural aversion to monarchy and individual domination informed their perception of Caesar's accumulation of honors, particularly his title Dictator Perpetuo. Sources including Suetonius, Plutarch, and Appian emphasized that senators interpreted these developments as existential threats to republican governance. While Caesar maintained formal legality, the substance of authority had shifted decisively to personal command, creating structural tension that no conventional procedure could mitigate. Elite fear was informed both by precedent and ideology. Roman political culture idealized collegial magistracies, annual office rotation, and senatorial oversight as safeguards against tyranny. Caesar's reforms, though effective in addressing social and administrative inefficiencies, undermined these mechanisms by concentrating power, bypassing traditional debate, and relying on personal networks of loyalty. Epigraphic evidence and coinage depicting Caesar's singular authority reinforced the perception that the Republic's symbolic and practical checks had been nullified. Senators understood that acquiescence risked normalizing autocratic rule, while opposition carried the danger of reprisal from loyal veterans and institutionalized influence. In response, a coalition of senators, later known collectively as the Liberators, organized a conspiracy to remove Caesar. Literary sources frame the conspirators' actions in the language of tyrannicide, emphasizing legality in principle rather than legality in practice. Brutus, Cassius, and allied figures articulated a moral and structural rationale. The assassination was intended to restore institutional balance, reaffirm senatorial authority, and prevent the permanent concentration of power in a single individual. Their rationale highlights a fundamental tension in late Republican governance. Personal authority, though formally legal, could structurally undermine collective decision-making, creating a crisis in the very definition of constitutional legitimacy. The conspirators meticulously coordinated their plan around the Ides of March. Senate procedures, seating arrangements, and ritual practices provided predictable patterns that were leveraged for political action. Sources note that the conspirators exploited Caesar's confidence in his legal and ceremonial immunity, demonstrating that knowledge of institutional regularities could be repurposed to enforce extraordinary political outcomes. This strategy underscores the structural fragility of Republican mechanisms when confronted by actors willing to leverage procedural expectation against dominant individuals. Republican legality remained in form, but enforcement of constraints relied on collective elite initiative rather than institutional power. The conspiracy also reflected the persistent structural interplay between public and private authority. While Caesar commanded loyalty from veterans, provincial populations, and civic networks, the conspirators drew on senatorial alliances, social prestige, and moral legitimacy to counterbalance his influence. Literary and epigraphic records indicate that this counter-network relied heavily on coordination and secrecy, illustrating that collective elite action had become the principal tool for contesting concentrated personal power. The structural necessity of cooperation among senators demonstrates the limits of individual authority, even in a context where formal legality and personal domination were unbalanced. Despite their careful planning, the conspirators' solution was inherently destabilizing. Assassination could remove an individual but could not immediately reconstruct the institutional framework that Caesar had effectively hollowed. The procedural void created by his death risked further escalation, as no existing mechanism could enforce compliance or guarantee orderly succession. Republican structures depended on consensus and procedural adherence, but the assassination replaced these with contingency and improvisation. The conspiracy therefore exemplifies a paradox of late Republican governance. Restoring balance required an extraordinary act that structurally intensified the system's fragility. By 44 BCE, senatorial anxiety had reached its culmination. Fear of permanent autocracy, reinforced by Caesar's consolidation of military, legislative, and administrative authority, motivated decisive extralegal action. The conspirators framed the assassination as a restoration of constitutional norms, yet the structural impact of the act would immediately propagate instability. Republican legality, once the central arbiter of elite competition, was subordinated to collective enforcement by a minority. The assassination illustrates the chronic tension between formal law and structural power. When personal authority eclipses institutional capacity, extreme measures become both politically conceivable and historically consequential. In conclusion, the conspiracy against Caesar demonstrates that elite fear was not purely personal or emotional but deeply structural, rooted in the collapse of traditional mechanisms to check concentrated power. The planned assassination was framed as tyrannicide, but it represented an attempt to substitute collective initiative for formal enforcement. The solution, while removing a single actor, deepened the underlying systemic crisis, illustrating that in the late Republic legality alone could no longer regulate political authority. The structural transformation of Roman governance had reached a critical juncture. Extraordinary action had become the only instrument capable of addressing the imbalance created by Caesar's concentration of power. Extraordinary power became law. In the wake of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Rome's political landscape was dominated by chaos, factionalism, and the threat of renewed civil war. The power vacuum left by Caesar's death made clear that traditional republican institutions were no longer sufficient to regulate elite competition. By 43 BCE, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, formed a political alliance with Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Unlike the informal First Triumvirate, this new coalition, historically referred to as the Second Triumvirate, was formalized through legislation, the Lex Titia, passed by the Comitia in November 43 BCE. This law granted extraordinary authority to the three men, legitimizing their coordinated exercise of power and creating a legal framework for what was, in essence, a consolidated military dictatorship. The Lex Titia reflected both political necessity and structural adaptation. With senatorial authority weakened and republican offices fragmented by the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus required a mechanism to mobilize resources, coordinate armies, and restore order. The law conferred powers including joint imperium, extraordinary command over legions, and the right to enact legislation without traditional senatorial or magistrate approval. Literary sources such as Appian and Cassius Dio emphasize that the law transformed extraordinary authority, previously informal or extralegal, into a formalized institution. The legal codification of personal power marked a decisive shift. The Republic now accommodated concentration of authority through legislation, rather than merely tolerating it in practice. The structural function of the Second Triumvirate was multifaceted. Each member brought complementary sources of influence. Octavian commanded loyalty as Caesar's heir and political successor, particularly among urban and veteran populations in Italy. Antony held senior military authority and alliances in the eastern provinces, particularly with veteran legions experienced in Caesar's campaigns. Lepidus, though less militarily prominent, provided control over parts of Cisalpine Gaul and access to veteran networks. The codified power-sharing arrangement allowed the three men to coordinate campaigns, suppress opposition, and control strategic regions simultaneously. Epigraphic evidence and coinage from this period commemorate their joint authority, reinforcing both legal legitimacy and public recognition of the extraordinary power structure. The triumvir's formation was also a response to the immediate political crisis. In 43 BCE, the Senate and urban administration were paralyzed by factional disputes between Caesarians, Pompeians, and the senatorial elite. The consolidation of authority under a legally sanctioned triumvirate enabled decisive action, including the suppression of senatorial opposition and the coordination of military forces across multiple provinces. By legitimizing extraordinary command, the Lex Titia allowed the triumvirate to bypass the procedural constraints that had hampered both the late Republic and the First Triumvirate. The law illustrates how institutional formalization of personal authority became a mechanism for structural stabilization in the absence of functioning republican governance. The political and legal consequences were immediate. The triumvirate enacted proscriptions targeting former opponents and consolidating resources to finance military campaigns. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence documents confiscation of estates, redistribution of wealth, and reorganization of local governments under triumviral authority. By combining legislative sanction with military enforcement, the Second Triumvirate effectively fused legality and coercion, creating a governance model in which extraordinary powers were institutionally recognized and operationally enforced. The codification of authority transformed civil war into a legally framed and structurally managed process. Importantly, the Lex Titia set a precedent for the integration of personal networks into state authority. Whereas the First Triumvirate relied on informal coordination among elite actors, the Second Triumvirate demonstrated that extraordinary power could be both legally recognized and structurally embedded within the republican framework. Coinage, inscriptions, and municipal decrees reflect both the acknowledgement of formal office and the concentration of decision-making in 3 individuals. The law institutionalized a system in which power derived from a combination of legal sanction, military loyalty, and coordinated political networks, rather than traditional collective governance. Despite the formal legality, structural instability persisted. The triumvirate's authority relied on cooperation among 3 individuals with overlapping ambitions and access to independent military resources. The Lex Titia provided a legal framework, but enforcement depended on continuous coordination and the threat of coercion against opponents. The law did not resolve underlying tensions between personal armies, provincial loyalties, and elite competition. Rather, it provided a mechanism for temporarily aligning interests. The concentration of power made subsequent conflict predictable. Once political and military objectives diverged, the mechanisms for peaceful resolution were absent. By the end of 43 BCE, the Second Triumvirate had consolidated extraordinary authority and created a legal foundation for total civil war. The combination of codified imperium, control over legions, and legislative capacity enabled the triumvirs to act decisively against remaining republican resistance. The formalization of personal power illustrates that late republican governance had evolved structurally. Extraordinary authority could now be sanctioned by law, operationalized through military command, and reinforced through coercive measures. Violence, previously extralegal or contingent, was now embedded in the system, demonstrating the structural transformation of the republic into a state in which legality and military dominance were inseparable. The republic paid for order in blood. Following the formal establishment of the Second Triumvirate through the Lex Titia, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus moved swiftly to consolidate power through a systematic campaign of proscriptions. These actions targeted political opponents, former senators, and individuals deemed loyal to the assassins of Julius Caesar. Contemporary sources, including Appian and Plutarch, describe the proscriptions as both a tool for eliminating opposition and a means of generating resources to fund military operations. Estates were confiscated, property redistributed, and public lists circulated to identify those subject to execution, illustrating the structural entanglement of political authority and coercive violence. The proscriptions served multiple functions within the late Republican system. First, they eliminated rival elites who could challenge the triumvirate's extraordinary authority. Cicero, who had vocally opposed Antony and championed senatorial prerogatives in his Philippics, became the most prominent victim, executed in December 43 BCE. Epigraphic records and literary accounts document the confiscation of his property and the systematic targeting of his political allies. Second, the proscriptions redistributed wealth and reinforced loyalty among supporters. Confiscated estates were often allocated to veterans or allies of the triumvirs, embedding material dependence on their authority and securing operational compliance. The combination of political elimination and resource allocation illustrates a deliberate structural strategy to consolidate power. The mechanisms of the proscriptions required coordination between military authority, civic administration, and judicial processes. Lists of targeted individuals were officially sanctioned, yet their enforcement relied on local magistrates, allied legions, and private agents. Archaeological evidence, including records of confiscated estates and urban inscriptions marking redistributed property, confirms the scope and systemic implementation of these measures. Literary sources emphasize that the proscriptions extended across Italy, Cisalpine Gaul, and other key regions, demonstrating how centralized extraordinary authority was operationalized on a provincial scale. The integration of legal sanction, military enforcement, and administrative bureaucracy highlights the structural sophistication of triumviral control. The social and political consequences were profound. Elite networks were disrupted, local governance destabilized, and republican norms subordinated to the imperatives of extraordinary command. Cicero's death exemplified the symbolic and functional impact. Prominent figures who represented institutional authority and political discourse were eliminated, signaling that opposition to the triumvirate carried lethal consequences. Contemporary accounts emphasize the psychological effect on surviving senators and magistrates, who were compelled to align with the triumvirs or risk similar fate. Violence thus became both a mechanism of resource allocation and an instrument of structural enforcement. The prescriptions also illustrate the merging of legality and coercion. Although formally sanctioned through triumviral authority, the execution of political enemies bypassed traditional senatorial review or trial procedures. Republican law remained intact in theory, yet enforcement was subordinated to extraordinary power. Literary sources highlight that the triumvirs justified these measures as necessary to restore order and secure the state, framing mass executions as politically and structurally rational. The alignment of legal sanction with lethal enforcement created a precedent in which institutional authority was inseparable from the capacity for coercive action. The operational scope of the prescriptions extended beyond Rome itself. Provincial cities and strategic regions were subject to enforcement by military commanders acting on behalf of the triumvirs. Control over legions and veteran networks ensured compliance and prevented organized resistance within critical territories. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and property records, confirms that confiscations and reallocations were systematically implemented. These measures reinforced the structural principle that centralized authority could be sustained only through coordinated control of both resources and armed force, institutionalizing coercion as a political instrument. Despite the immediate effectiveness, the prescriptions also generated long-term instability. Surviving opponents, many of whom fled to the eastern provinces or allied territories, regrouped under the leadership of figures such as Brutus and Cassius. The elimination of domestic elites created a vacuum that necessitated ongoing military campaigns to secure compliance, demonstrating that consolidation through terror produced a temporary equilibrium contingent on continued enforcement. Structural stability was maintained only by a combination of fear, loyalty networks, and operational oversight, illustrating the limitations of extraordinary power in creating enduring governance. By the end of 43 BCE, the Second Triumvirate had achieved rapid consolidation of authority, but at significant cost. Political terror, mass executions, and the redistribution of property provided immediate operational control while subordinating traditional republican structures to personal authority. The prescriptions reinforced the structural principle that extraordinary legal sanction, military power, and resource allocation could be combined to enforce political dominance. Yet they also ensured that opposition would persist abroad, setting the stage for continued civil conflict and the eventual confrontation at Philippi. The Republic's survival was no longer determined by law or consensus, but by the capacity of extraordinary power to enforce compliance. Rome ruled as two halves. Following the consolidation of power under the Second Triumvirate, the administration of the Roman state was effectively divided among Octavian in the west and Mark Antony in the east, with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus occupying a marginal role in Africa before his eventual removal from authority. The territorial allocation reflected both practical military necessity and personal ambition. Antony assumed responsibility for the wealthier eastern provinces, including Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, while Octavian exercised authority over Italy, Gaul, and the western provinces. Literary sources, including Plutarch and Cassius Dio, describe this division as both administrative and symbolic, highlighting the emergence of dual centers of power within the former republic. The division allowed for regionally focused governance while consolidating military authority. Antony's command in the east included significant legions, provincial governors, and client kingdoms such as Commagene and Cappadocia. Coinage and inscriptions from Asia Minor and the Levant reflect the exercise of de facto independent authority, including financial administration, civic dedications, and troop deployment. Octavian, meanwhile, leveraged control over Italy and the western provinces to manage veteran settlements, financial resources, and urban administration. This structural separation created a dualized system of governance in which coordination occurred primarily through negotiation and political signaling rather than centralized republican institutions. Antony's Eastern focus introduced new cultural and political dynamics. His alliance with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, integrated Egyptian resources, naval capacity, and regional diplomacy into Roman operations. Literary sources emphasize that Antony relied on Egyptian grain, mercenary forces, and the administrative infrastructure of Ptolemaic governance to sustain his campaigns and consolidate his eastern position. The alignment of Roman military authority with foreign political structures exemplifies the transformation of republican power into a system increasingly mediated through regional client networks. The East became both a theater of operational control and a source of political leverage in Roman elite competition. The dual administration also exacerbated political and cultural divisions. Antony's prolonged presence in the East, adoption of Hellenistic court practices, and public association with Cleopatra were leveraged by Octavian in propaganda to portray Antony as alien to traditional Roman values. Literary sources, including the writings of Cicero and later historians, frame this period as a conflict of loyalty, culture, and legitimacy. Rome was split not only territorially but ideologically. The structural consequence of territorial division was that political rivalry could now be waged across geographic and cultural fault lines, with each center consolidating military and administrative authority independently of the other. Administrative practice in the East under Antony demonstrates the operational autonomy of regional authority. Provincial taxation, troop levies, and public works were managed through Antony's direct oversight, while local client rulers acted as intermediaries. Archaeological evidence, including coins bearing Antony's portrait and inscriptions recording civic decrees, illustrates the formalization of his presence as both a Roman authority and a regional power broker. This concentration of regional power reduced reliance on traditional republican channels such as the Senate, underscoring a structural shift in governance. Authority was increasingly exercised through personal networks and territorial command, rather than institutional procedures. At the same time, Octavian maintained structured authority in the West, ensuring administrative continuity and control over veteran settlements, taxation, and civic governance. Numismatic evidence and urban inscriptions demonstrate the integration of financial and military resources under his supervision. By managing the Western provinces as a cohesive administrative unit, Octavian secured both the loyalty of urban populations and operational readiness for future campaigns. The dual administration thus represented a functional division of labor and a structural experiment in decentralized control of an expanded Roman state. The territorial split also created conditions for escalating conflict. Antony's reliance on Eastern resources and Octavian's control of Western legitimacy established separate power bases that could independently support military operations. Propaganda, coinage, and public ritual were employed to reinforce allegiance and legitimize authority in each sphere. The Roman state was no longer unified in terms of practical governance. Dual administration amplified structural vulnerabilities by making resolution of disputes contingent upon negotiation or conflict between autonomous centers of power. By 36 BCE, the division of the Roman world had become institutionalized, with Octavian controlling the West and Antony consolidating the East alongside Cleopatra. While functional governance was maintained, the structural consequences were profound. Cultural differences, regional loyalties, and military independence became key determinants of political alignment. This arrangement set the stage for the ensuing confrontation, as propaganda, public perception, and operational control transformed territorial separation into a strategic and political weapon. Rome, once governed as a single republic, was now effectively administered as two halves, each with independent military and fiscal authority, creating the conditions for the final civil war that would resolve the republic's centuries-long structural crises. Perception became a weapon. As the territorial division of Rome solidified, the rivalry between Octavian in the West and Antony in the East evolved from administrative competition into a contest over legitimacy and public opinion. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, formalized through personal and political cooperation, offered him access to Egyptian resources, naval power, and Hellenistic prestige. Yet this alignment provided Octavian with material for a sustained propaganda campaign, framing Antony's Eastern focus as a deviation from Roman tradition. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and Plutarch, emphasize how Octavian exploited Antony's relationship with Cleopatra to portray him as alien, corrupt, and a threat to Roman customs. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE exemplify the structural and symbolic stakes of Antony's Eastern orientation. Through public ceremonies, Antony distributed territories of the Eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and her children, including regions in Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus. Coins and inscriptions issued at the time highlight Cleopatra's elevation and her recognition as queen of multiple provinces. While these acts reflected legitimate control over Roman client territories, Octavian framed them as evidence that Antony subordinated Roman interests to a foreign ruler. The donations served both practical purposes, securing loyalty, distributing resources, and establishing dynastic authority, and political risks, providing Octavian with a narrative that questioned Antony's fidelity to Rome. Octavian's propaganda strategy relied on formal and symbolic instruments. Coinage, public speeches, and Senate decrees emphasized Antony's alleged subordination to Cleopatra, contrasting it with Octavian's adherence to Roman values and ancestral piety. Numismatic evidence depicts Octavian as princeps, guardian of the Republic, and defender of Roman traditions, while Antony and Cleopatra were portrayed as decadent and foreign. The campaign demonstrates the structural function of perception in late Republican politics. Control over narrative and symbolism was inseparable from military and administrative authority. Elite and popular support could be mobilized or undermined through carefully constructed public imagery. The interplay of propaganda and territorial administration reinforced the emerging structural polarization of the Roman state. Antony's eastern territories operated with operational autonomy, supported by Egyptian logistics, naval forces, and Hellenistic bureaucratic infrastructure. Octavian's western provinces, by contrast, relied on veteran networks, urban organization, and republican legitimacy to maintain cohesion. The contest was not only military but institutional. Each center leveraged its administrative and symbolic resources to justify authority and constrain the other. The distribution of territory, military command, and civic influence became instruments in a broader battle over the definition of Roman legitimacy. Antony's alignment with Cleopatra also challenged traditional Roman norms. The elevation of her children as beneficiaries of the donations created a quasi-dynastic structure within the eastern provinces. Literary accounts emphasize that Antony's policies disrupted conventional republican expectations of inheritance, magistracy, and senatorial prerogative. While these measures enhanced loyalty among Eastern allies and ensured operational support, they intensified Octavian's narrative that Antony threatened the structural integrity of the Republic. Cultural and dynastic practices became political tools, demonstrating that governance in the East was inseparable from symbolic and relational authority. The propaganda campaign had structural consequences for military and political alignment. Legions in the East, though loyal to Antony personally, were increasingly aware of Octavian's narrative framing, which cast loyalty to Antony as potentially illegitimate. Conversely, Octavian consolidated Western support by positioning himself as the defender of Rome, Rome's law, and ancestral tradition. Epigraphic evidence and coinage indicate extensive coordination to ensure that local elites, urban populations, and provincial authorities aligned with one or the other faction. Control over perception directly influenced operational command, illustrating the inseparability of symbolic authority and military effectiveness. By 32 BCE, the strategic and ideological confrontation had reached its peak. The combination of Antony's reliance on Egyptian resources, dynastic consolidation, and operational autonomy created a polarized political structure, while Octavian's propaganda framed the East-West divide as a moral and civic imperative. The use of narrative, symbolism, and legislative instruments alongside military preparation demonstrates how perception functioned as a core element of structural control. Political legitimacy was no longer derived solely from republican office or traditional procedure. It required the alignment of public perception, military loyalty, and administrative authority. Conflict, structured around both territory and legitimacy, moved inexorably toward final resolution. Antony's eastern alliances and Octavian's western consolidation set the stage for the confrontation at Actium, where military engagement would become the decisive instrument in adjudicating claims of authority. The structural polarization, amplified by propaganda and the donations of Alexandria, ensured that the political crisis could no longer be resolved through negotiation or institutional mediation. The interplay of perception, legitimacy, and power had transformed Roman governance into a system in which symbolism, administrative control, and military capacity were inseparable, defining the final phase of civil war in the Roman Republic. Victory demanded restraint. Following the decisive outcome at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian emerged as the uncontested dominant figure in the Roman world. Mark Antony and Cleopatra had been eliminated, and the eastern provinces were nominally integrated into Roman administration. The structural task facing Octavian was not simply military control, but the consolidation of authority across a state previously fractured by decades of civil war. Literary sources, including Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Appian, emphasize that Octavian relied on both strategic restraint and institutional integration to secure lasting dominance. Octavian systematically dismantled remaining opposition while retaining administrative continuity. Provincial governors loyal to Antony were either removed or co-opted into new administrative structures, and veteran legions were incorporated under his direct oversight. Epigraphic evidence records the appointment of trusted commanders to key posts, ensuring loyalty and operational control without disrupting local governance. Octavian balanced coercive measures with pragmatic integration, demonstrating a structural understanding that sustainable authority required both enforcement and legitimacy. Financial and military consolidation were closely linked. Confiscated estates, inherited from Antony's supporters or formerly held by Cleopatra's client networks, were redistributed to veteran soldiers, cementing loyalty through material dependence. Inscriptions and coinage commemorate these settlements, indicating both the practical and symbolic dimensions of consolidation. Control over fiscal resources and veteran populations ensured that Octavian possessed the operational capacity to deter any resurgence of civil opposition, illustrating how structural authority in late Republican Rome depended on integrated military, economic, and administrative strategies. Octavian also navigated the Republican institutional framework with calculated subtlety. Rather than openly abolishing traditional magistracies or the Senate, he maintained their form while ensuring that authority ultimately derived from his sanction. Literary accounts describe his careful use of consulships, tribunician powers, and extraordinary commands to exercise control without provoking elite backlash. By preserving republican forms, Octavian provided a sense of continuity and predictability, demonstrating that structural legitimacy could be reinforced through careful manipulation of existing institutions rather than overt autocracy. The consolidation of power extended to symbolic and ideological instruments. Coinage, monuments, and public rituals emphasized Octavian's role as princeps, first citizen and guardian of the Republic, while simultaneously signaling his supremacy over military and political structures. This approach allowed him to merge practical authority with perception of legitimacy, ensuring that loyalty and compliance were rooted in both institutional acceptance and public acknowledgement. Numismatic and epigraphic evidence from Italy and the western provinces confirms the integration of these symbolic strategies into the broader consolidation of control. Octavian's approach illustrates a deliberate structural strategy. Authority was not enforced solely by coercion, but by embedding operational, economic, military, and symbolic mechanisms within the framework of the state. Military command ensured compliance, fiscal management secured resources, administrative appointments maintained governance, and public imagery reinforced perception. By coordinating these elements, Octavian stabilized Rome after decades of civil war, while avoiding the overt alienation of remaining elites, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how systemic power and legitimacy could coexist. By the end of 30 BCE, Octavian had effectively neutralized opposition, absorbed eastern territories, and secured loyalty across the Roman world. Military and administrative consolidation provided practical control, while symbolic and institutional measures reinforced legitimacy. The structural transformation of the Roman state was now complete, Authority was centralized in a single individual, but operationalized through a combination of military oversight, fiscal management, and institutional continuity. This consolidation laid the foundation for the transition from republic to principate, in which personal authority could coexist with the outward forms of republican governance. The process of consolidation highlights the interdependence of power and legitimacy in late Republican Rome. Operational dominance, while necessary, was insufficient on its own. Enduring authority required formal recognition, administrative integration, and alignment of elite and popular loyalties. Octavian's strategy demonstrated that the end of civil war did not simply depend on military victory, but on the careful structuring of governance, perception, and institutional authority. Victory demanded restraint, and restraint allowed authority to transform from coercive imposition into stable, enduring power. The Republic survived in name only. In 27 BCE, Octavian undertook a formal reorganization of Roman governance, marking the transition from civil war to the Principate. The settlement involved the careful restoration of republican forms while concentrating authority in a single individual. Through a combination of legal, institutional, and symbolic measures, Octavian secured personal dominance while maintaining the outward appearance of republican continuity. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio, Suetonius, and Appian, emphasize the duality of this transformation. The Republic remained formally intact, yet substantive power resided with one man. The settlement began with Octavian's voluntary restoration of extraordinary powers to the Senate. Publicly, he relinquished control over certain provinces and magistracies, presenting himself as a citizen willing to return authority to the collective institutions. In practice, the Senate ratified these transfers in ways that reinforced Octavian's supremacy. Provinces with military significance, particularly Egypt, Gaul, and the Balkans, remained under his direct command. Literary sources indicate that Octavian strategically selected provinces containing loyal legions and economic resources, ensuring operational control while preserving the illusion of senatorial prerogative. The constitutional framework effectively centralized power in his person while retaining republican procedural forms. Key to the settlement was the creation of the title princeps, or first citizen, which embodied both legal authority and public legitimacy. Octavian combined this status with tribunician powers, granting him the ability to convene assemblies, propose legislation, and veto senatorial measures. Coinage and inscriptions from 27 BCE present Octavian as princeps, the guardian of laws and republican institutions, while simultaneously signaling his ultimate authority. The combination of symbolic representation and formal powers illustrates a structural innovation. Political legitimacy could be codified without disrupting the perception of institutional continuity. The constitutional settlement also reinforced Octavian's monopoly over military authority. Provinces with strategic importance, particularly those containing legions loyal to him personally, remained outside senatorial oversight. Literary accounts and epigraphic evidence indicate that these allocations ensured both the operational independence of his forces and the integration of military loyalty into political governance. The structural implication was clear. The legitimacy of the Principate rested upon the alignment of institutional authority, military command, and public recognition, rather than any purely legalistic framework. Fiscal and administrative reforms complemented the new constitutional order. Octavian assumed control of Rome's treasury, provincial taxation, and distribution of land for veterans, integrating economic resources with political authority. Records and inscriptions demonstrate systematic coordination of provincial administration, reflecting a centralized governance model under the guise of republican procedure. By linking financial control, military command, and institutional authority, Octavian ensured that loyalty, compliance, and operational capacity were aligned, establishing the structural foundation for enduring dominance. The settlement also addressed elite and popular perceptions. Octavian carefully managed the Senate, magistrates, and civic institutions to secure elite cooperation, while promoting his image among urban and provincial populations. Propaganda, coinage, and public rituals emphasized his role as restorer and guardian of Roman traditions. Literary accounts suggest that by preserving republican forms while exercising concentrated authority, Octavian mitigated resistance, reinforced loyalty, and embedded the perception of legitimacy across multiple social strata. The structural success of the settlement depended not only on coercion or legal authority, but on convincing elites and citizens that the transformation of power was consistent with republican ideals. Structurally, the 27 BCE settlement marked the formal inception of the Principate, a hybrid system in which concentrated authority operated within the outward appearance of traditional republican institutions. Legal forms, magistracies, and senatorial processes continued, yet operational power, control over armies, provincial administration, and fiscal resources, was firmly centralized in Octavian. Numismatic evidence, inscriptions, and public dedications confirm that this duality was recognized both symbolically and practically. Republican governance survived in name, but substantive authority resided with the princeps, creating a durable framework for imperial rule. The constitutional settlement also codified mechanisms to prevent the reemergence of civil war. By integrating loyal legions, controlling strategic provinces, and managing elite interests, Octavian minimized opportunities for rival power bases to emerge. Structural stability was achieved through a combination of personal authority, institutional design, and symbolic legitimacy. While outwardly maintaining republican forms, the Principate ensured that future succession, administration, and military command remained aligned with the princeps, effectively neutralizing the systemic fragility that had characterized the late Republic. By formalizing this hybrid governance model, Octavian initiated a new political age. The Principate combined the operational benefits of concentrated authority with the symbolic legitimacy of republican institutions. Public perception, military loyalty, fiscal control, and institutional integration were coordinated to create structural stability, demonstrating that Roman governance could survive civil war not by restoring the republican equilibrium of the past, but by innovating a system capable of managing the complexities of empire. The settlement of 27 BCE thus represents both an endpoint, the conclusion of decades of civil war, and a structural beginning. The Roman state entered a new political age, centralized under a single authority yet outwardly republican in form. Peace required permanence. The Roman civil wars had fundamentally restructured the state, producing a system in which military authority, personal power, and legal sanction were inseparably linked. The Principate, established under Octavian in 27 BCE, replaced the fragile republican equilibrium with a centralized governance model. Authority was concentrated in a single individual, yet maintained within the outward forms of republican institutions. Literary sources, including Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, emphasized that this structural transformation ensured operational stability while preserving the semblance of constitutional continuity. The military dimension was central to this new order. Control over legions, previously a potential source of factionalism, became the structural basis of authority. Provincial assignments were deliberately aligned with loyalty to the princeps rather than the Senate, and veteran settlements were used to reinforce allegiance. Epigraphic and numismatic evidence indicates that military patronage was institutionalized. Soldiers' loyalty was directed toward the office of the princeps rather than to individual generals or regional elites. This ensured that the structural mechanisms of coercion and defense were embedded in the political system itself. Administrative integration complemented military centralization. Provinces were governed by magistrates or legates appointed with the approval of the princeps, ensuring that both civil and military administration operated under a unified command. Fiscal control, including taxation, treasury management, and allocation of public lands, was similarly centralized. Archaeological surveys of provincial infrastructure and inscriptions recording administrative decrees confirm the scope and coordination of governance. By linking economic resources, military authority, and administrative oversight, the Principate created a durable framework capable of preventing the recurrence of civil conflict on the scale of the late Republic. Institutional continuity was maintained strategically. Republican forms, magistracies, Senate meetings, assemblies, remained intact, providing a veneer of tradition that legitimized authority. Octavian's careful use of the consulship, tribunician powers, and senatorial consultation allowed him to exercise control without overtly abolishing existing offices. Numismatic and epigraphic evidence reinforces the symbolic dimension of governance. Public imagery emphasized restoration, legality, and continuity, ensuring that structural authority was recognized both formally and socially. The Principate thus represents a hybrid system in which centralized power was exercised within an institutional framework designed to convey legitimacy. The structural transformation extended to succession planning. By controlling both military and administrative resources, the princeps could direct the alignment of elites and ensure continuity across generations. Loyalty networks, integrated through military service, fiscal dependence, and political appointments, created systemic resilience. Literary sources suggest that this coordination of authority and allegiance reduced the likelihood of internal insurrection while providing mechanisms for orderly transition of power. Structural stability now depended on the interdependence of authority, institutional recognition, and personal allegiance. Social and political memory also reinforced the new system. The narrative of civil war, public commemorations, and monuments celebrated the restoration of peace, while marginalizing the legitimacy of former Republican rivals. Coinage, inscriptions, and public rituals linked Octavian's authority to the restoration of order, embedding the perception that continuity and stability required centralization. By shaping collective memory, the Principate ensured that structural legitimacy was not solely a function of coercion or law, but also of public recognition and ideological reinforcement. The transformation had consequences beyond governance. Military, fiscal, and administrative centralization allowed Rome to operate as a cohesive imperial state capable of responding to both internal and external challenges. The lessons of civil war informed the structuring of provincial oversight, legionary organization, and legal authority, creating a system in which operational efficiency and legitimacy were mutually reinforcing. Structural integration ensured that the capacity for civil unrest was limited, and that political authority could withstand the pressures that had destabilized the late Republic. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Republic had been transformed into a military monarchy under the Principate, balancing centralized authority, institutional continuity, and public legitimacy. The structural transformation ensured that governance no longer relied on elite consensus or ad hoc agreements. Authority was embedded in the alignment of military, administrative, fiscal, and symbolic systems. The consolidation of power and integration of governance mechanisms created the conditions for a durable imperial state, demonstrating that peace required permanence, and permanence required the deliberate structural reorganization of Rome's political order. Thank you for following the story of Rome's transformation. If you found this deep dive insightful, subscribe to Nightfall History for daily historical documentaries, click the bell icon to stay updated, and leave a comment sharing which moment of Rome's civil wars or transition to empire intrigued you the most.